Hello, hello. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and today I've got the Pro Tools screen open because we're going to be going over some of my favorite magic tricks with multiband compression. And not just multiband compression, but multiband processing, also multiband expansion. I gotta say, as much as I use multiband compression, I think multiband expansion is one of the more underutilized, underrecognized tools that can be extremely useful, especially in what I do every day, which is mastering. But multiband processing is not just for mastering. There's so many mix applications for multiband processing, notably some of my favorites being on bass, drums, vocals, acoustic guitar, and we'll look into all of that. But we'll start out with some of the multiband applications for mastering, because that's one of the places where I think it's uniquely powerful. And I'd say at least on 20% or more of the masters I do, I end up having to use multiband processing, often as a, let's say, fix-it kind of tool to deal with problems that I run into mastering, but also as just a nice creative massager. And we will look into exactly how I do that. The multiband processor I have pulled up here is one from Maselec. I'm a big fan of these. I started mastering in high-end analog mastering studios. In case you're new to the channel, you don't know me, I'm a platinum certified mastering engineer, so I've at least master well enough that it doesn't totally ruin the prospects of a record getting heard, hundreds of millions of times on streaming and all that. So I have some success with mastering. And when I began, I was on a hybrid setup where I was dealing with high-end analog hardware. Today, I master pretty much exclusively in the box using digital tools, but I use a lot of analog model digital tools. And the one I'm going to be showing all these techniques with today is one that has just come out. It's from one of my favorite companies for mastering hardware, and that is Maselec. This Maselec MLA-4 multiband compressor and expander has just recently been modeled by Relab. If you want to try it out for yourself, you can go over to relabdevelopment.com and you can try it for free for 14 days. We had one of these in the mastering studio where I started, Joe Lambert Mastering, and we had, in particular, the stereo unit is really what I kind of grew up on, and then this multiband unit is also phenomenal. I've been a fan of a whole bunch of Maselec's high-end mastering stuff. Their MEA2 EQ, which I now use in the box constantly, is one of my favorite EQs to use when I'm mastering, as well as we also had their high frequency limiter is amazing. I hope Relab and Maselec model that one next. It's an absolutely wonderful tool. But this particular tool, the MLA-4, is not just a great compressor, it's also a great expander. And I'm going to show you some of my favorite magic tricks with multiband processing, which are also focused around using expansion in addition to compression and how that can help you, particularly in mastering, but also in some of these mix applications. We'll listen to expansion on bass and on drums, and I think you're going to be really pleased at what it can do. I've got a whole bunch of great tracks here. Last quick note about Maselec before I get into showing off some of these tools and some of these ideas is, in case you're not familiar, this original box probably would have cost $8,000 or more, maybe close to $10,000 as a piece of hardware. And right now, I believe that Maselec is doing this plugin for, I think it's like $200, but it's on sale right now for about $150 as an intro special. And you can try it for free for 2 weeks over at relabdevelopment.com. The guy who made this, Leaf Massey's, man, his Maselec gear is in practically every single high-end mastering studio that puts out like platinum and Grammy-winning releases. I mean, his stuff's all over the place. The studio I was in not only had the compressor, the EQ, the de-esser, and also a Maselec console in addition to other stuff. So just really gorgeous sounding stuff. All right, let's get into some of the ideas. And before I start playing you sounds, and we will play around with a bunch of sounds, I promise, I think it's really important to know what to listen for before I start just playing you things. So I want to give you a quick overview of, I think, the most important ways to use multiband compression, multiband expansion in mastering, and then in mixing. And once you have those concepts in mind, I'll give you audio examples for each of those concepts on at least 3 or 4 different audio examples in here. All right, so how do I use multiband compression and expansion? All right, the big thing for me is when it comes to mastering, I'm trying to do as little as possible, as little as I have to make sure that the mix sounds like the mixer intended for it to sound, only better, I hope. So my goal usually is not to totally reinvent things and dramatically alter things. But every once in a while, you run into issues that can't be solved by EQ or by compression alone. Your most powerful tool in mastering is your EQ, hands down, no question about it, followed possibly by your limiter, also a really important tool in mastering. Compression, slightly less so, but can also be significant. And things like saturation and stereo enhancement, all of those things are part of mastering. But when traditional EQ and compression can't do it, so often do I have to reach for multiband processing, particularly to solve problems in the low end and the high end. And I'll give you a couple of the most common problems I might have to solve right now. Actually, in the particular song that I have brought up here by a really talented artist named Bradley Johnson. Thank you so much for sharing your track. We'll hear it in just a second. I ran into a couple of issues with the low end. He had a great mix where the balances really worked well together, but the mix overall was a bit dark. And one of the things that ideally could be done even better in the mix is he had this one tom that poked out a little bit much in just the bottom end of this tom. And I would love to just control the fundamental of this tom and only when that tom hits. This is a great application potentially for multiband compression, where we can zero in on the fundamental of that tom. So let's say it's at 90 hertz. And when 90 hertz hits and 90 hertz is blossoming too loud, we can just go in there and immediately tuck just the initial impact at 90 hertz and tuck it down. And if it's off to the side, we can put the multiband processor just on the side. So we're tucking down, say, just in the left-hand side. This is a great application for multiband compression. Doing the same kind of thing to a kick drum could be big as well. Maybe there's just a little bit too much initial impact or attack on the kick drum. We don't want to get rid of a whole bunch of low end all the time, but we just want to soften the attack of the kick drum a little bit. That's another great application for going in with a multiband compressor and just tucking down the initial impact of something like a kick. But one of my favorite things to do, and something you're going to hear in just a second, is the exact opposite of that. This is multiband expansion in the low end. So sometimes, like in this mix that Bradley has here, the mix was a little bit dark compared to all of his favorite records that he was throwing out there. So I needed to get rid of a little bit of low end and a little bit of low mid-range in his mix in order for it to really sing and have all the detail and excitement that you'd expect out of a final commercial release. But in doing that, I don't necessarily want to totally castrate the impact of the kick drum. So something you can do with a multiband processor is to put it in expansion mode. And now, whenever the signal passes above the threshold, instead of getting turned down, it gets turned up. So what we can do with this is I can turn down the low end, say below 100 hertz, but every time the kick hits, we can just make that kick goose up a little bit. So every time we have a kick hitting, we bring back some 100 hertz, but we can reduce all that low frequency stuff when the kick is not hitting. And that's exactly what I'm doing with it on this track. You know what? Let's jump into and just hear a little bit of that, some of the before and after, and then I'll go into some of the applications that are more pertinent to mixing, particularly on drums, bass, acoustic guitar, and vocal, which I think are some of the prime places and most important places for most of you to use multiband compression. Another quick thing I'll say that I wanted to play around with on this track is the idea of high frequency compression and limiting. Sometimes I'll get a master where I want to control maybe the cymbals or some really bright element in there and just smooth out the high frequency transients without getting rid of too much high frequency. That's a great place to get rid of some high frequency transient while keeping the overall treble there. It's a great place to use a fast attack multiband compressor. Now, right before I play this, I keep on saying just one more thing, being like Lieutenant Columbo over here, if I'm not dating myself with this reference. Just so you understand how this tool works, this is our low band of compression here, our mid band of compression here, and our high band of compression here. These big threshold knobs allow us to turn down the threshold for each band, so I can have a different threshold set for my lows, my mids, and my highs. And over here in the meters, you'll see how much compression is happening in red to the low, mid, or high band, or how much expansion is happening in blue to the low, mid, or high band. I'll get into some of the other controls in just a second if you really want to nerd out about this and know how to use this exact tool inside and out. But a couple more quick controls for you to be aware of. We got our attack and release down here for each band. And up here, there's a ratio. And when the ratio control goes to the left, this is a compressor ratio. And when this ratio control goes to the right, it's an expansion ratio, meaning it's turning things up that go above the threshold. All right, that's enough yakking for now. Let's hear this thing before mastering and after mastering, except I won't turn on the multi-band compressor expander just yet. So here's what Bradley's original mix sounded like on this song, Writing's Not on the Wall. Thank you again so much, Bradley Johnson, for letting me use this track in here. This one is as of yet unreleased, but he just sent it to me and it was a great application for multiband processing. So I'm super excited to be able to use it. Here's his original mix. And the thing that I'll tell you is if you actually listen to records in this style, everything works except for the fact that it's just way darker than the average for his style. All right, here's the end of the first chorus going into the second verse.
It's not ready to fall. It's not yet on the wall. You're naive with your smiling. It's a sight to behold. No weights around your ankles, no pressure upon your soul. We'll just dance.
So good arrangement, good performance, good writing. There's this really anthemic quality to the chorus that's really nice. But if you actually listen to this record against other records in this style, you would immediately say, oh man, the top just sounds kind of veiled and things sound kind of a little dark, a little murky, and we're having trouble picking out the details in the instruments. So let's hear it with some EQ, tiny bit of spatialization processing, but so far with this multi-band processor turned off. Here is an after of the same end of the chorus going into the verse.
You're naive with your smiling. It's a sight to behold. No weights
Original.
around your ankles, no pressure upon your soul.
EQ.
We'll just dance beneath these street light lamps. Yeah, they burnt out years ago. But up there in the night
There's our original
sky, there's
again.
that same familiar glow. The stories left to be.
So you hear how it just opens up and we start to hear more detail and it's just a lot less cluttered, particularly in the chorus. But the one thing that we're starting to miss here is this is one of those rare tracks where the kick drum kind of 4 on the floor thing that's happening is important and we can get some more meat out of it. Now, I'm going to exaggerate things here a little bit. I'm going to put this processor more intensely than I probably would in a real master, but just for demonstration purposes, I want you to be able to hear what's happening. And what's going on here is that we have some expansion happening in the low frequencies. I've set it so that below 100 hertz, whenever this kick drum crosses the threshold, it's just going to be amplified a little bit more. So you might not hear these changes if you're listening on your phone or on laptop speakers, but if you're listening on good headphones or decent studio monitors, anything that reproduces 100 hertz and below well, you should be able to hear this kick drum kind of coming forward significantly. And I also have a little bit of high frequency smoothing happening here where I've put on a little bit of high frequency compression just to kind of smooth out the top end a little bit. Let's hear a quick before and after where I'll take this mastered version and I'll turn this multiband processor on and off. And you should really feel that kick drum starting to leap up, especially in the back half of this verse. Here's our before.
You're naive with your smiling. It's a sight to behold. No weights around your ankles, no pressure upon your soul. We'll just dance beneath these street light lamps. Yeah, they burnt out years ago. But up there in the night sky, there's that same familiar glow.
So hopefully you can hear what's happening there. I can exaggerate even further if you want. Hold on one second while I cough on this live stream. I'm getting over about a week of the flu here. My apologies for that. But let's go back and just listen into that section one more time. And maybe I'll even boost this a little bit further still to exaggerate it even more for you. Here's our original before anything.
These street light lamps, yeah, they burnt out years ago.
Brighter, but we lose some low end.
In the night sky, there's that same familiar glow. There's stories left to be told. Mistreated feelings, this is nothing new. The kinds of games life plays to confuse, but you will rise up.
And I think you can hear what's happening there. The whole track kind of brightens up more, opens up more. And then by adding this additional processing, we start to lift the kick drum a little bit. And there's this nice softening that's also going on in the top end by just doing some high frequency compression that gives it almost a slightly more tapey quality. So again, I'm setting this probably a little bit more significantly than I would in a real master, but if you have a system that's reproducing 100 hertz and below, you can hear what I'm doing is I'm subtracting a whole bunch of 100 hertz generally. So I'm bringing down that by like 2.5 dB, and then I'm bringing up just those kick hits by like 6 dB. This is more significant, like I said, than I would do in a master, but hopefully I'm pushing it far enough so that you can hear it. You can also do the exact inverse of this. I could boost our low end and then take things down on our kick hits. Let's hear what the inverse would sound like in that same exact spot. So now we're going from expansion in the lows to compression in the lows. Let's hear that.
These street light lamps, yeah, they burnt out years ago. But up there in the night sky, there's that same familiar glow. The story.
And then again, I can lower the amount of low frequency, but have it boost just on those kick hits. So just with these two dials, selecting whether we're doing compression or expansion, how much of it, and whether we're cutting or boosting our lows, we can significantly reshape the bottom end and kind of change the relationship between the kick and the bass. And again, this is not something I'm going to do by default on every single master. It's just like on an as needed basis. And there's some masters where I'm not going to try to touch this stuff at all. But when I want to significantly reshape the relationship between kick and bass, and that's something that the mixer actually is really appreciative that I'm going to be able to do for them, multiband processing can be a great tool for this. That said, use these things sparingly, use them carefully, because often the best masters are the most minimal masters where you're not doing all of this stuff. But when you need to, man, these are some of the most powerful tools you can use to reshape low end and high frequencies in mastering. Let's check out some more of my favorite applications, which are outside of the mastering context. In general, when it comes to mixing, I'm not going to recommend that you use multiband processors on your mix bus, with some exceptions. I think you're better off trying to do most of the multiband processing you're going to do during the mix on individual tracks and subgroups, like a drum subgroup or a bass subgroup or an acoustic guitar subgroup. Those are probably the best places to use them. It is possible that if you just throw a multiband compressor on everything, you can sometimes suck the life out of things a little bit. You can get rid of some of the soul in them. You can steer things towards being too over-processed. But another cool thing that multiband compression can do is, instead of making things sound over-processed, you can make things even more transparent by just focusing in your compression on only the area you want to compress and nowhere else. A great application for this is on bass. Often when it comes to bass, if you compress your entire bass track, you can lose some of the life and the punch and the detail, and you can get these kind of weird tonal hotspots in the bass. But if instead you focus your compression on a bass to just the low end, just the stuff below 150 hertz or just the stuff below 100 hertz, that's often where you can start to dig in with a lot of compression, but not really hear the compression, because you're not compressing the mid-range where the real heart and soul and detail and audibility of the bass lives. Instead, you're just compressing and tightening up the low end to keep it from getting too out of control. Another example of that would be on drums, where you could slightly compress just the mid-range, leaving the high frequencies untouched. That's another great application for multiband compression. When we hear compression on drums and we hear it being grating and aggressive and leaving lots of artifacts, the most likely place for that to happen is on the high frequencies, on the cymbals on drums. But if we can just compress our mid-range and leave our kick drum relatively untouched and our high frequencies relatively untouched, we can get some of the control and some of the attitude of compression without all of the crazy artifacts. So just using a little bit of mid-frequency compression on drums while leaving other stuff untouched is a great application, or just compressing the low end on a bass. I've got this fun track here from a band called Cartoon Lizard. It's a great band name, by the way. These guys, Richie and a couple of his other bandmates have sent me their tracks to work on. And this is one that I think is in my Compression Breakthroughs course. It's got a really fun bass and drum track, kind of quirky, alternative indie feel. Like there's this off-kilter, funky element to it. And this is really unprocessed. This is just super unprocessed drums and bass. Let's hear what the drums and bass sound like together with absolutely nothing on them. And then we'll look a little bit more deeply into the bass and what we can do to EQ or to multiband process the bass to tighten up the bottom end. So here's the bass and drums together from this track. So really raw, right? Ooh, great fill. Let's zero in on just the bass. So some of these notes jump out a little bit more than others, and there's something that's a little bit indistinct about the bass sound. Now, one of the common mistakes that people make on a lot of beginner and intermediate mixes is that they won't really compress the low end enough on the bass, and they won't try to get enough of the sound of the bass from the mid-range. They'll try to get as the sound of the bass just by boosting up the bass track, just by raising its volume. But when you do that, you usually amp up the low frequencies. And often this can really start to destroy the headroom in your mix and clutter up the low end without you hearing the bass anymore. We often want to really find a place in the mid-range of the bass, anywhere from like 300 hertz to 4 kilohertz, depending where we are. It could be the low mids, it could be the center mids on rock bass, it could be 800 hertz or 1K on more of a kind of jazz fusion bass, it could be 2K or 4K at the upper mids. We want to find some place in the mid-range for that bass to speak and become audible without having to load a whole bunch of 100 hertz into it. And multiband processors are a great way to do that, where we're effectively sidechaining the bass and compressing the low end separately from everything else. Let's hear a quick before and after on the bass. I'll boost the bass level just a little bit more. And here's our before. It's bringing out more of the growl and mid-range of the bass. And you can see a ton of compression in the lows and a little bit of expansion in the mids. Here's our before. And the bass sounds so much louder right now, but if you actually look at it on the meters, it's basically level matched before. What's happened to it is the bass tone has become a little bit more mid-rangey. The mids have come forward, the bass is coming under greater control, and I'm actually making some of the mid-range detail leap out a little bit more. So it still feels like a dynamic performance by doing a little bit of expansion on the mids, but doing a ton of compression on the lows. Now, the expansion on the mids isn't necessary, but since it's possible with this tool, and I love the way the expansion sounds on the MLA-4. Somehow it just never gets this out of control feeling that some expanders do. One of the things that has made this be one of the most popular compressors out there in the mastering context is just how incredibly transparent it can be, even with really extreme settings and even with really fast release times. The guy who designed this, Leif Massey, I think was just really brilliant with the way that he programmed the release characteristics on this device. So it never has this really kind of jumpy, overly processed sound in either compression or expansion mode. There's just something about, there's probably some type of multi-stage release curve in here that is just, it's so clean sounding, even when you do a lot. There's a couple other cool hardware compressors out there that are this style, analog 3 bands. There's a couple from some other companies based on the APIs, which can be really aggressive and tight sounding, based on the Neves, which can be really kind of luscious and silky and give a little bit of extra transformer saturation in the lows and low mids. And those can be absolutely cool as well. But when you really like the tone that you have and you just want to reshape things in a really transparent way, I think the MLA-4 is probably one of the best ones out there for it. So whenever you already really like the tone, man, this is the one to go for. So we can do the same kind of thing to the drums. What do I have going on here on the drums? Let's see. Let's solo these drums. And here, I think I'm trying a little bit of high frequency compression. Now, I did say that sometimes the high frequencies are where we hear the artifacts the most on the drums. But sometimes, if you do it just right, if you set really fast attack compression, you can sometimes smooth out the high frequencies on things like drums without getting these kinds of harsh side effects. You're less likely to get some of the harsh side effects when you're dealing with fast attack times on the high frequencies and slower release times. The more that you're erring towards slower attack times and fast release times, the more that sometimes you bring up some of the trash and edge and garbage candy quality on things like cymbals. So I am trying a little bit of kind of smooth, high frequency, almost de-essing on this, and then trying just a little bit, I think, of mid-range compression. Let's hear before and after on the drums. I'll turn these up a little bit too. Here's our before. Ooh, I'm doing some expansion on the lows here again. Hear that edit point? Before. Ooh. After. So that's interesting. What's happening here is that I'm doing actually some really significant compression to just the high frequencies. And then I'm doing a little bit of an expansion in the low frequencies. And I think you really hear that kick and the toms kind of like bounce a little bit more. Here I'm doing the exact opposite of what's happening on the bass. Instead of adding more control to the lows, we're saying, okay, on this track, let's have some of the low fundamental be carried by the kick and the toms. That's where the groove's happening. And we're going to take the bass, and it's so melodic and complex, that bass, we're going to make the bass a little bit more mid-rangey. And we're going to take some of the luscious lows on the kick and the low toms and just goose them up when they're hitting. And then adding a little bit of softening in the top. I think it's cool. It's even though we're kind of really, in a way, messing up the sound by compressing a lot, it sounds more hi-fi to me after the compression than before. We can tweak this a little bit further still. One of the cool things that I like about the Maselec MLA-4 is that it has this auto gain matching feature, but it also has this auto spectral balance feature. And this is something really unique in multiband compressors that I'm not used to seeing. I don't think I've seen it on any other multiband compressor. If we use this level match, and I'll play this for you in just a second, this will level match the before and after. So we're not, misled by just increasing level on the drums. However, if we do this different type of level matching, the spectral balance level matching, it's going to rebalance the lows, mids, and highs so that it actually level matches for frequency response. What do I mean by this? Well, if we are expanding the lows and bringing up the lows by 6 dB, right? And we're compressing the highs by 6 dB, all of a sudden our signal has gotten more bassy. But if we click this spectral balance button, it's going to level those out. It's going to notice, hey, we're increasing low end by 6 dB. Let's turn down the low band by 6 dB. Hey, we're lowering high end by 6 dB. Let's turn those high frequencies back up by 6 dB. So we'll bring them back to the frequency balance that you had before you were doing multiband compression. So you're able to reshape the envelope of each of these individual bands without changing the relative frequency balance of each band. So this is really interesting. You can change the density and the attack and release profile of each of these bands pretty extremely without actually changing the amount of low end or high end or mid range in the balance. So let's do a little bit of before and then after with level matching and then with the spectral balance applied. Here's our before again on drums. Nice fill. Let's level match it. It's kind of learning the level for a second here. And then when it stops flashing, it's figured it out. It's going to turn everything down by about 5 dB. Here's our before. And our after is actually darker, right? So in this case, once we level match them, we can see that if we actually turn down the level, the whole sound has gotten a little bit darker. Man, when this thing was adding level, I was really liking what it was doing because it was bringing up some of the low end and bringing down some of the high end. But if we use the conventional level matcher on here, I don't love what's happening because the thing that I liked about what this processor was doing is that it was adding low frequency. But if we go ahead and just turn the whole thing down to compensate for that, then I'm not adding low frequency anymore. I'm just making the sound darker. So this is a case where I wouldn't want to use level matching. I'm trying to add low frequency and the level matching is working against me. Now, another thing that we can do instead, just so you could hear what's happening here, is the spectral rebalance. And this is going to make it so that it knows that we're taking down a whole bunch of high frequency and boosting a whole bunch of lows. What would happen if we were just compressing the high frequencies and expanding the lows, but then rebalancing them afterwards? Let's give that a try. Here again is our before. Our after, really lifting those lows. And now let's turn our spectral balance on. Give it a second to learn. All right, it's learned it. It's going to turn down the lows a little bit here. Ooh, and you hear how hot the highs are now, right? Let's listen to that one passage here where we have some stuff going on with the shaker. Here's our before. So that's cool. We have really compressed high frequencies. That groove is so cool. Why doesn't the drummer play that groove for like another 8 bars? Stick with that. All right, here's our before. And our after. Tasty. Very different thing happening now. Instead of bringing up our lows now, it has the effect of kind of bringing up the highs, but these really smooth, controlled highs. So it has a very different and kind of more sheeny quality than before. I still think in this case, I like it with the spectral balance tool turned off, where we're just lifting those lows and softening the highs. Man, that's just cooler than the original to me. Now, one more application, maybe we'll get to 2 more applications. Let's see how far that we've been going here. How many minutes in? We're about 30 minutes in. My goodness, I can go on forever on these. We'll try to keep this to be a mini masterclass. I'll try to keep it under 45 minutes. I'm going to give you one more thing, which is acoustic guitar. And this is one of the big places I think more and more people could start using multiband processing. It's often enough on an acoustic guitar to just apply some fast attack compression. But sometimes when you apply enough of fast attack compression to an acoustic guitar to make it sound like an acoustic guitar on a record, you can end up over compressing the thing and making the thing sound too inorganic, too processed, or you can start to get these weird resonances in the low mids and low frequencies. And then you get into this place where it's like, now I got to take a whole bunch of lows and low mids out of the acoustic guitar, even more than I want to take out. But if you could instead just use some really fast attack compression only on the highs or only on the highs and upper mids, that's also often going to serve your acoustic guitars much better. is one of the most common hallmarks of a kind of beginner to intermediate level mix, the way they treat acoustic guitars, especially for artists where they do a whole bunch of pre-programmed or virtual instruments that all sound like super studio quality, right? You have these sampled drums, or you have these virtual drum kits, or you have these beautiful sampled strings, or you have these great synthesizers. And then what are the only instruments that are actually recorded with microphones? Acoustic guitar and vocals. And the acoustic guitar and vocals are often woefully undercompressed compared to all this other more synthetic or more pre-processed, more commercial sounding stuff. And what'll happen in those cases, the acoustic guitars, they just have this really jangly, inconsistent high frequency that pulls them forward, glues them to the front of the speaker because they have all of this transient detail in the top end. And then that engineer, even if they think saying, hey, I know I'm supposed to compress my acoustic guitars, and they throw like an LA2A on it, and it doesn't touch the transients at all, and the transients come through, and if anything, the transients get amplified further still. And the more transient information you have on an instrument, the more it kind of jumps forward to the front of a mix, the more it's in front of other elements. And usually, in most mixes, that's not what you want for your acoustic guitars. Usually, acoustic guitars should not be the most forward element in the mix. But you don't necessarily want to set them back by trying to darken them excessively so you have really muddy, murky, indistinct acoustic guitars. And you usually don't want to set your acoustic guitars back by putting like a ton of reverb on them. That's not usually the sound. Usually, what makes acoustic guitars sit so well in your favorite releases that you actually love the sound of is that the transients, particularly in the high frequencies, are really softened and smoothed out without sucking the life out of the instrument. And the way to do that is often with multiband compression or dynamic EQ or things like de-essers. And that's something we can do here on these guitars. So these guitars here are from a artist called Taylor Bloom. And I think this one is in my EQ Breakthroughs course. Let's hear how these acoustic guitars sound before and then after. I'm just going to play them in isolation, not in the whole mix. Whoops. Let's actually solo the right stuff. Here we go. So this is our before. Here's our after. Ooh, that's with spectral balance on. Let me turn that off. Chunkier. So here's our before. Let's turn this up a little bit. Oh, you know, I'm going to have to turn this automation to off so I can actually boost the level on these acoustic guitars. You'll probably hear that a little bit better, yeah? So here we still have a significant amount of low end. If anything, we're actually adding low end by goosing the level overall and taking down some of the high frequencies. This might be actually a little bit too much low end in the context of a whole mix, but you might tell me, listening to this thing in isolation, that maybe you're hearing the compression too much. But I've got to tell you, this is the way that acoustic guitars really sound on actual records. They have this kind of smoothing in the upper mid-range and the high frequencies. And I really think you've got to hear in the full context of an entire band what it sounds like to do this slightly heavy-handed amount of compression on acoustic guitar before and after. And if you're new to compression and you're starting to get this much compression and you're starting to say, oh, but I'm losing all the beautiful transients and the natural sound that I had, you got to listen to thing in context and say, okay, what's happening in the acoustic guitars? Are they coming forward in the mix or are they going back in the mix? And this kind of approach, without making the guitars really reverby or overly dark and boomy and bottom heavy, is going to move the guitars further back into the mix. Am I overdoing it a little bit? Maybe, but this is absolutely the right direction for like 80% of acoustic guitars on up-tempo tracks to go. One more time, here's a before. And it brings up some of the detail of like the hand slaps on the strings, some of the kind of muted percussive elements. The guitars all of a sudden are getting chunkier, more percussive sounding. We get a sense for what they're actually doing rhythmically. Because although we're losing some of the high frequency sparkle and transient and detail, that's okay. Those things are often a liability on acoustic guitars and mixes. We're getting some of the detail of what the hand is doing, like the actual rhythmic slaps on the instrument that are giving the thing its groove. And it gets a little bit more balance and life and movement because we're bringing up the right details while we're smoothing out the wrong details. Again, if we want to make this thing brighter, since we're doing so much high frequency compression here, we could turn the spectral balance on. And you hear once that kicks in, we'll still have the controlled transients, but an overall brighter sound. Let's hear that. Here's our before. Chunky and compressed. And now let's have the spectral balance go. Wait for it to stop flashing and it'll kick in. There it is, bringing up the highs. Before. I mean, it just sounds like a more confident performance, and it sounds more like a record. So that's another one of my favorite tricks there. I'm going to start running out of time for tricks. The last quick thing I'll say is that you can use these things a lot more transparently, let's say, by taking something like a vocal track. Here is Taylor Bloom's performance on this same song, just the vocal. And we can just focus the compression in on the mid-range. So here I have a ton of mid-range compression going on, but our compression is accented just there. And I have the spectral balance turned on. So it's actually going to make the vocal a little bit more mid-rangey overall. So admittedly, this is not going to be an extremely transparent vocal compression, but by doing a more subtle version of what I'm doing here, I think you'll hear what I mean. So here's our before.
Mikey was the last of us to go. He didn't need a super send-off show. He just waited until the lights went low and he slipped right off the track. Me, I'll make my exit soon. I can't roll smoke, so hold a tune. But I'm waiting for that clear loon to come and bring me back.
So there we're really just compressing the mid-range. And this also has the effect of turning down the lows and highs a little bit with the spectral balance on so that the whole vocal becomes a little bit more mid-range focused. And we have a lot more dynamic control without it sounding too overcompressed. Let's turn the spectral balance off and see what it sounds like without that mid-range boost. Here's a before.
Mikey was the last of us to go. He didn't need a super send-off show. He just waited until the lights went low and he slipped right off the track. Me, I'll make my exit soon. I can't roll smoke, so hold a tune. But
and here we might say, you know what? I'm hearing a little bit of sibilance in this track. What if I do a really fast attack compression and we'll also compress the highs a little bit with a really fast attack, really fast release?
Mikey was the last of us to go. He didn't need a super send-off show. He just waited until the lights went low and he slipped right off the track. Me, I'll make my exit soon. I can't roll smoke, so hold a tune. But I'm waiting for that clear loon to come and bring me back.
And we'll adjust this just a little bit
even
further.
Now I still believe.
Catch more S's.
Even though they had to leave, they're waiting for me on the other side.
This catching the S's better.
Of the great divide.
And then without it, it just feels a little bit more limp. I think I actually like this with the spectral balance turned on, which was effectively boosting our mid-range a little bit on the vocal. Let's hear that one more time. in context, I think this mid-range boost is going to help the vocal cut through a bit more, even if it makes it sound slightly less impressive out of context.
Mikey was the last of us to go. He didn't need a super send-off show. He just waited until the lights went low and he slipped right off the track. Me, I'll make my exit soon. I can't roll smoke, so hold a tune.
And again, we're not boosting the level significantly, but it sounds substantially louder, more confident, more controlled, and to me, it does not sound overprocessed. So if you're looking to do the kind of reshaping that you want to do with multiband compression without some of the artifacts of other types of analog modeled multiband compressors, I think this is a really fun one to do it with. I could go over even more of these controls in even greater detail. Maybe that's something for the Maselec channel itself. I hope this was a good overview of some of the main applications of multiband compression. To recap, some of my favorite applications here are in mastering, trying to find areas in the low frequency to add a little bit more control to, or ways to bring back little bits of hype in the low frequencies. When I'm cutting lows with an EQ, bringing back particular hits on maybe a kick or tom or bottom ends of bass, or using it as kind of a high frequency limiter, kind of smoothing the initial transient impact of high percussion elements or high acoustic guitars, or using it a little bit like a de-esser in a mastering context. Then after that, some of my favorite applications in the mix specifically are going to be bass. Man, compressing lows on the bass and compressing them more than your other elements. And potentially, if you're feeling like it and you want a little bit more kind of jump out of something like a bass, you can even put the expander on in the mid-range. So you can have these hyper compressed lows while you're able to get away with an even more dynamic mid-range. Be careful with the expanders, but I will say that with the expanders, one of the ones you have to be less careful with is this Maselec. Another great place to use the multiband compression is going to be on drums, either very slightly compressing just mids, like we were hearing on that track earlier, or you could use it just to lift a little bit of bottom end on a drum bus. This is particularly great for people who are doing sample-based music. Often enough, you can do these kinds of changes where you're trying to bring up lows or bring down highs just by actually mixing, go in there to your overheads track or your kick track and EQ them and turn them up and down. Those are the most important things. But when you're dealing with 2-track stereo loops or minimally recorded drums, sometimes these multiband tools can help do a little something else. And sometimes when you want the sound of bus compression on drums, but you don't want it excessively hitting your lows or excessively distorting your highs and your cymbals, just doing a little bit of bus compression, just focused in on the mids, can be a great way to go with compression on drum buses. Then after that, we looked at applications on acoustic guitar, one of the most woefully undercompressed instruments in beginner and intermediate mixes, particularly high frequency and upper mid-range, super fast attack, often super fast release compression, just to really control and smooth out and make more consistent those transients on acoustic guitars to actually control their dynamics, which is not going to happen with slow attack compression on acoustic guitar, and to kind of set them back and smooth them out in the mix so they're not always jumping forward out at you and feeling disconnected from the rest of the mix. And then finally using them on things like vocals. If you have a vocal that's properly EQ'd, meaning it's not overwhelming in the lows and the low mids, but you just want a little bit more control without taking away some of the hi-fi sound of the vocal, just a little bit of compression only in the mid bands, or a little bit of compression on the mids, and then a little bit of additional high frequency compression that's super fast. So we're using it almost like a de-esser to catch some of those S's, a little bit of that sibilance. That can be an absolutely great way to go on vocals. If you don't have a really nicely well-controlled vocal like on this one, then in that case, you might also want to use those lower bands or just a broadband compressor. But in general, that's another hallmark of some beginner and intermediate mixes is vocals that have excessive amounts of low and low mid in them. So sometimes in those cases, you can compress just the lows and low mids on the vocals and you caught everything else, but not them. All right, those are some of my main ideas, favorite places to use multiband compression and multiband expansion. Man, some of my favorite little magic tricks on this are when we lifted the kick drum in the original master, and on the drum bus, lifting the kick and toms with that expansion. Be careful with expansion because sometimes you can increase the dynamics too much, but if you use it with good taste, man, there's ways to bring back punch and excitement and impact and transient into your mixes. All right, so great to have you guys here. I would really strongly encourage you to go over to relabdevelopment.com. Check out this tool for yourself. Let me go ahead and do my play fast and loose and share my entire screen with you. You can get this thing on sale right now. They make a whole bunch of great tools. Man, their Relab LX480L, absolutely great. Big thanks to these guys for being longtime supporters of the channel. We've done a whole bunch of videos with them. I have a whole video series on the 4 ways to EQ anything, where I show off their MEA2 EQ. That one's absolutely one of my favorites. This Relab is like a sample accurate recreation, this LX480 of the original Lexicon reverbs that you find in pretty much every major studio in the world. They have great stuff. The Sonsig, the Rev 6000 EQ that came out recently. Check these guys out, relabdevelopment.com, and you have a 30-day money-back guarantee and a 15-day free trial. So check those guys out, relabdevelopment.com. Big fan of their stuff, supporters of the channel. And you know who else is a supporter of the channel? You! If you've made it this far, remember to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. Check out some of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, EQ Breakthroughs. You can check them all out over at members.sonicscoop.com. That's members.sonicscoop.com. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.